Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful and peaceful day. Today, we're going to explore the emotional journey of a man who once had money, success, and power, but still chose to leave everything behind to live deep in the mountains. Why would a successful CEO give up luxury buildings, business meetings, and a wealthy life just to raise pigs, grow vegetables, and search for peace in the countryside? Stay with us until the end, because Triệu Khang's story may completely change the way you think about happiness and success. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next emotional stories and journeys. There was a time when Triệu Khang earned more money before noon than most people could save in an entire month. Yet every night, he still sat alone inside a dark apartment, unable to sleep. The city had once looked like a dream to him. Towering buildings, expensive restaurants, crowded streets glowing with endless lights, and meeting rooms filled with people chasing success like it was the only thing that mattered. Back then, Triệu Khang believed that if he worked hard enough, if he pushed himself further than everyone else, then one day he would finally feel satisfied. But the strange thing about ambition is that sometimes the closer you get to success, the emptier your life quietly becomes. Now, the man who once spent his days surrounded by contracts and business calls stood deep inside a bamboo forest wearing mud-covered boots in front of a pig pen. Sweat soaked through his faded shirt while he carried heavy buckets of feed across the narrow dirt paths winding through the farm. Around him, there were no ringing phones, no traffic noise, and no assistants waiting outside office doors. There was only the sound of bamboo rustling against the wind, chickens scratching through loose soil, and piglets squealing from inside the wooden enclosures behind the house. Sometimes even Triệu Khang himself still struggled to believe this had become his life. He slowly pushed open the old bamboo gate leading toward the pig pens and stepped inside. The muddy ground clung heavily to his boots, while the piglets immediately began making noise after hearing his footsteps. Some pressed themselves against the wooden fence, while others climbed over one another, trying to reach the feeding troughs first. Triệu Khang grabbed a shovel and poured mixed feed into several containers lined along the enclosure. The repetitive movement no longer felt exhausting to him. In fact, there was something strangely calming about these quiet routines. Every task here felt real. Every drop of sweat had purpose. A few years ago, if someone had told him he would leave the city behind to raise pigs in the mountains, he probably would have laughed at them. Back then, his mornings started inside glass office towers, where every second of his schedule belonged to someone else. Endless meetings, endless pressure, endless responsibilities. He spent years moving from one crowded room to another while constantly staring at phone screens filled with unfinished work. Even during meals, his mind never stopped calculating numbers, contracts, and deadlines. Life moved so fast that he barely noticed how exhausted he had become. But here, in the mountains, everything moved differently. The air felt slower. His thoughts felt quieter. For the first time in years, he no longer woke up with pressure crushing his chest, before the day even began. Behind the farm stood a small wooden house, hidden among tall bamboo trees stretching across the hillside. The house was simple, with old wooden walls, a narrow porch, and a small yard overlooking the pig pens below. It looked nothing like the luxurious apartment Triệu Khang once owned in the city, yet somehow this place felt far more honest than the life he used to live. After feeding the pigs, he walked toward another enclosure hidden behind a bamboo fence. Today was the first day the youngest piglets would be separated from their mother. Triệu Khang slowly slid the wooden gate open before guiding the tiny piglets into their new pen. At first, the little animals stumbled nervously across the dirt floor. Some squealed loudly while pressing their noses against the fence, desperately searching for the familiar scent and warmth of their mother in the neighboring enclosure. Others wandered around aimlessly before huddling together in the corner. Triệu Khang leaned quietly against the bamboo fence while watching them. The scene reminded him too much of himself years ago when he first arrived in the city. Back then, he had also felt lost, overwhelmed, and completely alone. From a distance, the city looked beautiful. Everything about it promised success: expensive cars, confident people, bright buildings filled with opportunity. It convinced him that happiness was waiting somewhere ahead if he just kept running long enough. But after years of chasing success, something inside him slowly disappeared. The more money he earned, the emptier he became. The more successful he looked to others, the less he understood why he was working so hard in the first place. A sudden squeal pulled him back to the present. One of the piglets had climbed halfway into the feeding trough, while another pushed it aside, trying to eat first. Triệu Khang grabbed a smaller bucket filled with feed, prepared for newly weaned piglets, before slowly pouring portions into several troughs around the enclosure. At first, the piglets hesitated nervously, but eventually, hunger became stronger than fear. One by one, they slowly approached the food. Some still squealed while eating. Others constantly turned their heads toward the old pen, as if hoping their mother would somehow return for them. Triệu Khang watched them carefully before speaking softly to himself. Humans really aren't that different. Sooner or later, everyone has to learn how to survive alone. His voice disappeared quietly into the sounds of the farm, while the piglets continued pushing against each other around the troughs. Growth had never been comfortable. Not for animals, not for people either. Sometimes life forces you into unfamiliar places before you're ready. Sometimes you lose everything familiar before discovering who you really are. As the day grew hotter, sweat soaked through the back of Triệu Khang's shirt while he continued cleaning the enclosures behind the wooden house. He pushed an old wheelbarrow through the narrow dirt paths between the pig pens while gathering dirty straw and leftover feed into the cart with a shovel. The repetitive work exhausted his body, but unlike his old life in the city, this exhaustion felt honest. Here, tiredness no longer came from pretending to be strong all the time. It came from labor, from soil, from carrying water, from fixing fences, from feeding living creatures, depending on him every day. While carrying another bucket toward the pig pens, a sudden flash of memory crossed his mind. a phone vibrating endlessly across a conference table, voices arguing inside a meeting room, rain reflecting against crowded streets outside tall office buildings, himself sitting silently among unfinished contracts while feeling completely numb inside. There were times back then when he felt like he was running endlessly without even knowing what he was chasing anymore. Money, recognition, success. Even now, he still didn't fully know the answer. The piglets crowded around the feeding trough once again, while Triệu Khang slowly sat down beside the bamboo fence. Some of them no longer cried for their mother. They had already started adapting to their new life, one small step at a time. He stared at them quietly for a long moment before lowering his eyes toward his mud-covered boots. Then he finally spoke. "I used to think I was successful." His voice became quieter as he looked toward the endless mountains beyond the bamboo forest. "Until the day I realized I no longer knew what I was living for." Life on the farm was far more exhausting than anything Triệu Khang had ever experienced in the city. Yet strangely, this exhaustion no longer made him feel trapped. Every morning now began with mud-covered boots, stepping across narrow dirt paths between bamboo fences and wooden pig pens hidden deep inside the mountains. Instead of waking up to endless phone calls and unfinished schedules, he now woke up to the sound of piglets squealing for food and bamboo branches scraping softly against one another in the wind. Triệu Khang lifted another heavy bucket of feed onto his shoulder before walking slowly toward the far enclosure behind the small wooden house. Sweat soaked through the back of his faded work shirt after only a few trips between the storage shed and the pig pens, but he barely seemed to notice anymore. The repetitive work had slowly become part of his new life. Cleaning the pens, carrying water, repairing broken fences, mixing feed. Every task repeated itself day after day, yet for the first time in years, his mind no longer felt constantly crowded. The piglets rushed toward the feeding troughs the moment they heard his footsteps approaching. Some climbed clumsily over one another, trying to reach the food first, while others pushed their noses through gaps in the bamboo fence. Triệu Khang crouched down beside the troughs and slowly poured feed into each container one by one. Dirt stained his hands. Mud covered the edges of his boots. The smell of soil and livestock clung to his clothes constantly now. A few years ago, he would have hated living like this. But now, strangely, he felt more alive here than he ever did sitting inside luxury office buildings. After feeding the pigs, Triệu Khang grabbed a shovel and began cleaning the enclosure beside the wooden house. The wheelbarrow creaked loudly as he pushed it across the uneven ground, gathering old straw and leftover feed into piles near the edge of the farm. The work was repetitive and physically draining, but unlike the exhaustion he once felt in the city, this kind of tiredness allowed him to breathe. In the city, exhaustion came from pressure. Here, exhaustion came from living honestly. As he carried another bucket of water toward the pig pens, his mind briefly drifted back to his old life once again. Bright office lights, endless meetings, assistants knocking on conference room doors, voices arguing about contracts and profits while phones vibrated endlessly across long glass tables. Back then, every single day felt like a race he could never stop running. There were moments when he earned enormous amounts of money, yet somehow the emptiness inside him only grew larger. Triệu Khang stopped beside the bamboo fence and quietly watched the piglets eating together inside the enclosure. Some of them no longer cried for their mother anymore. They had already started adapting to their new life. Watching them slowly become independent reminded him of something important. Growth always hurts in the beginning. No one becomes stronger while staying comfortable forever. He slowly sat down on an old wooden chair beside the pig pen and lowered his eyes toward his dirt-covered hands. For years, he had believed success meant becoming wealthier, more powerful, and more respected than everyone else around him. But standing here in the middle of the mountains, surrounded by animals, soil, and silence, he was beginning to understand that maybe peace mattered more than success. Later that day, Triệu Khang left the farm and walked down toward a small village near the foot of the mountain, where local farmers were harvesting watermelons across a wide open field. Endless rows of watermelon vines stretched across the farmland, while workers moved continuously between the crops, carrying baskets and pulling wooden carts filled with freshly harvested fruit. Triệu Khang stepped carefully between the vines before crouching down to lift a large watermelon from the ground. Dirt still clung to the surface of the fruit after weeks resting against the soil. Around him, the farmers worked without stopping. Some cut watermelon stems with knives, while others passed the heavy fruit from hand to hand toward carts waiting near the dirt road. No one stood still for long. Every movement connected naturally to another. A local farmer handed Triệu Khang a freshly sliced piece of watermelon while standing in the middle of the field. He took a bite and immediately tasted the sweetness spreading across his mouth. For a brief moment, he simply stood there quietly watching the people around him continue working beneath the open sky. And suddenly, something became very clear to him. No sweet harvest ever comes from laziness. Every meaningful result in life demands patience, effort, and endurance. The watermelon fields reminded him of his own life. There had been many seasons where he worked endlessly without seeing immediate results. There had been moments when pressure and exhaustion made him want to give up completely. But maybe growth worked the same way for people as it did for crops. Sometimes the hardest periods of life are simply part of the process before something meaningful finally grows. Soon, Triệu Khang joined the farmers, loading watermelons onto wooden carts near the edge of the field. Dirt covered his hands as he lifted the heavy fruit over and over again. Sweat ran down his neck, while the farmers beside him continued working without complaint. There were no expensive watches here, no luxury suits, no competition over status or wealth. Yet somehow, the people in this field looked far more peaceful than many executives he once knew in the city. After returning to the farm, Triệu Khang walked slowly through the vegetable garden beside the wooden house, hidden inside the bamboo forest. He grabbed a hoe and loosened the soil around several rows of vegetables before carrying buckets of water across the narrow paths between the garden beds. Nearby, Piglets squealed loudly from inside the pens, while bamboo branches swayed quietly around the property. For the first time in a long while, his movements no longer felt rushed. There was no meeting waiting for him, no phone vibrating inside his pocket, no pressure forcing him to move faster than his own thoughts. After finishing the work outside, Triệu Khang entered the small wooden kitchen beside the house. He placed freshly harvested vegetables onto a low wooden table before crouching down beside the stove to light a small wood fire using dry bamboo and old pieces of firewood stacked against the wall. Smoke slowly rose through the kitchen while he stirred food inside an old pan over the fire. In the city, meals used to be rushed and forgettable, interrupted constantly by work calls and unfinished business conversations. But here, every meal felt personal because everything around him came directly from his own labor. The vegetables, the firewood, the farm, even the silence. Carrying the finished meal outside, Triệu Khang sat alone at a small wooden table facing the pig pens and the endless mountains beyond the bamboo forest. Dirt still covered his hands. His shirt remained soaked with sweat from the day's work. Yet, instead of exhaustion, he felt something unfamiliar slowly growing inside him. Peace. He lowered his eyes toward his rough hands, resting on the wooden table before speaking quietly to himself. Maybe. He paused for a moment while listening to the distant sounds of the farm around him. This is the life I was actually searching for all along. After leaving behind a stressful life filled with money, pressure, and endless business meetings, CEO Triệu Khang slowly begins adapting to a quiet life deep in the mountains. Surrounded by bamboo forests, pig pens, and vegetable gardens, he spends his days carrying feed, cleaning barns, harvesting crops, and learning how to live peacefully again. While helping local farmers harvest watermelons, Triệu Khang realizes that every meaningful reward in life requires patience, effort, and sacrifice. As he watches piglets slowly learn to survive on their own, he also begins reflecting on his own painful journey through loneliness, ambition, and emotional exhaustion. Far away from luxury buildings and crowded streets, the countryside gradually heals the emptiness inside him. For the first time in many years, Triệu Khang starts questioning whether true happiness comes from success or from finally living a life that truly feels real.